Since Ukraine invaded the Kursk region of Russia, a fascinating trend has been occurring. Russian soldiers have been surrendering to Ukraine in droves, and some of them are now even choosing to volunteer to join the Ukrainian military and fight against Russia. Not what Putin wants to see from his dedicated and loyal troops. Exact numbers of surrendering soldiers are hard to come by, but Ukraine has claimed the number is in the hundreds, with most media estimating the number to be between 1,000 and 2,000 as of the date of this video. But whatever the case, it's clear that Russian troops are in fact surrendering in huge numbers, as it's been confirmed by multiple sources with photo and video evidence. Notably, this number of surrendered Russian soldiers is potentially larger than the number of Ukrainian soldiers in Russia that they surrendered to. And some have observed that far more Russian soldiers have chosen to retreat from or surrender to the invading Ukrainians than have chosen to fight against them. A massive difference from what the world saw occurring when Russian soldiers entered Ukrainian territory 2.5 years prior. In that case, Ukrainian soldiers and citizens alike mounted a courageous defense of their home territory, which they apparently valued much more than the Russian soldiers value theirs. This is part of the reason Ukraine was able to make such easy progress as they invaded Russia, capturing up to 1,000 square kilometers and 74 villages in just the first week of fighting, according to Ukrainian officials. More than Russia managed to take of Ukraine in the entire year leading up to the offensive. This trend of surrendering soldiers is more troubling for Moscow than you might at first think, and at first, you probably already think it's pretty troubling. That's because the surrender of Russian troops seems to have the potential to create a positive feedback loop, where the more Russian troops that choose to surrender rather than fighting makes it more likely that future Russian troops that encounter Ukrainians will make the same choice. And the deeper Ukraine pushes into Russia, the more Russian soldiers seem to be losing the will to fight, which is the opposite of what one might expect. The desire for Russian soldiers to surrender is so strong that there are already credible rumors of a Russian battalion that ended both their commander and their second-in-command, who were ordering them to fight so that the troops underneath the commanders could surrender to Ukraine instead. Maybe it's all just part of Putin's master 3D chess plan to sneak Russian troops behind the Ukrainian front lines. Or maybe it is what it appears to be on the surface. Russian soldiers don't want to fight against Ukrainians, something that is quickly spiraling into a narrative that the Kremlin can no longer control. To deal with issues like this in the past, Russia has implemented a few strategies. But in this case, the Kremlin is panicking because those strategies don't seem to be working anymore. Previously, when Russian soldiers were captured on Ukrainian territory, the Russian military developed a habit of telling many of their families that they had been killed in action instead of captured, even going so far as to sometimes provide fake remains that the families then buried. This was to prevent people from putting pressure on the Russian government to negotiate for the release of prisoners. And it worked, until Ukraine figured out what was going on, and captured Russian soldiers began making frequent phone calls home, with several mothers and wives receiving phone calls from sons and husbands they thought they had buried months earlier, who their government told them were a lost cause. Many of these soldiers even gave video interviews saying they were treated better by their Ukrainian captors than they were by their own Russian generals, with more food to eat and better living conditions, and a greater sanctity shown towards their life overall. That's not a surprise, since Ukraine was willing to acknowledge their existence when their own government had left them for dead. No wonder Russia didn't want these men coming home. But with the cases staggered far across the country, Russia could easily quiet down the impacted families to keep the narrative under control on the home front, threatening mothers and wives with arrest if they made public remarks or protest, most of whom simply gave in to these pressures since they lacked their husbands and sons close by to protect them. Ukraine has learned this lesson, and with the recently captured soldiers from Russian territory, Ukraine has now been putting them on video right away and allowing them to call home, where many of them have already requested to be exchanged for Ukrainian prisoners, something we imagine is creating quite the stir in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where many of these captured soldiers come from, and where their numbers are too large to be ignored or shoved under the rug. And the fact that they came from Moscow and St. Petersburg also helps speak to why these soldiers were captured so easily, with most of the Russian prisoners being 18 to 21-year-old conscripts completing a mandatory year of military service in an area that was thought to be far from the front line. These men did not want to join the military. They were forced to, and given poor training as well. When the going was easy, they were no doubt proud to don their military uniforms and show they were doing their part for their country. But when the real fighting came, it's no surprise that they chose to surrender and avoid it rather than engage in a battle of futility. You see, for years, Russia has had different segments of their military. The first segment is those most likely to be placed on the front lines, those without families who are likely to be able to make a public stir, coming from places like prisons or from deep in Siberia, with few connections to the outside world, topics we've already covered individually and proven in their own full-length videos on this YouTube channel. The second segment is those most likely to be placed in safer back-end logistics or security details far from the front. These are men coming from areas closer to the public eye, like Moscow and St. Petersburg, who do have families that could create a public stir. Men like the conscripts who have now been captured on what was thought to be safe Russian territory. With up to 2,000 men from these areas now captured, in Ukrainian control, and being given phones to call home for help, the situation is likely to soon reach a point where the narrative can no longer be easily controlled by the Kremlin. In fact, that point has probably already been reached. But there is another factor that led to such a surprising scale of Russian soldiers surrendering to Ukraine's Kursk invasion, and that is the blocking units, or, in this case, the lack thereof. In previous videos, we've also covered how Russian soldiers have been forced to charge Ukrainian positions and fight under hopeless circumstances through the use of blocking units. These blocking units consist of Russian soldiers who point their guns at the backs of their own men to prevent them from retreating from combat. And many of these blocking units consisted of Chechen volunteers, who often portrayed their strength on social media, leading them to become known as the TikTok battalions. These Chechen blocking units felt strong and confident when they could control the direction of attacks away from their positions, forcing less fortunate men into battle while they remained in comparative safety. But with Ukrainian forces coming directly at them across the border in Kursk, the Chechens no longer felt that sense of control or security from their positions, and they fled instead. Perhaps they were even ordered to flee by the Kremlin, so that reports of blocking units firing on Russian conscripts from Moscow or St. Petersburg would not create a massive public stir. Whatever the reason, with no blocking units remaining to force them to fight, and with poor training and poor to no equipment, the conscripts had no reason not to give up. Ukraine would be smart to continue giving these men better lives than they had at home, to show other Russian soldiers that there is nothing to fear from surrender, and that there is no reason to pointlessly waste their lives. There are many other reasons Russian soldiers would choose to surrender rather than fight if given the chance. In previous videos, we've covered systemic corruption in the Russian military, which has resulted in inadequate food and equipment for Russian soldiers, and created a military culture where soldiers are in it for the good of themselves, rather than the good of their country or their brothers in arms. Other soldiers are contract soldiers there to fight for large sums of money, not something that motivates you to continue fighting when you find yourself facing overwhelming odds. You might take money when you think you have a good chance of survival, but the calculus changes when you are staring your destiny in the face. And all this proves that the strength of a military should not be measured primarily by its numbers, but rather by intangibles, such as the will and the courage to fight, which, in the end, prevail or fall long before the other factors are exhausted. Since I've covered details of corruption in the Russian military in previous videos, I won't repeat them here. But for more information, be sure to click one of these videos on screen for the rest of the story. If you do so, you won't be asking why Russian soldiers are surrendering. You'll be asking why more of them haven't done so sooner.